All right. Well, let's do this. This is coming from our heart. This is not coming from somebody asking us to do this. We believe that this is one of the most important conversations we can have right now.
We want to invite you on a journey.
Yeah,
a conversation. This isn't just for us.
All right, well, let's jump into this, Scott. Let's hit this conversation running.
3.
Yes.
It's June.
It's June. We're moving at a snail's pace. Ranking through here. The question now is, I love this chapter. This chapter in YouTube world wrote its own hook, wrote its own clickbait, all of it, right? Thank you, Bernie Sanders. Wait, what? And Bernie Sanders. We're bringing Bernie Sanders into this conversation.
Bernie Sanders into the conversation.
So, hey, there's Trapper. How are you?
Hey, Trapper. Yeah. Hey, again, we'd love to hear where you're from. Again, this is a conversation, so feel free to join in as we connect here in chapter 3 on we'll go even page 39 in your Resilient book. And Bernie Sanders. We're talking about Bernie Sanders. What?
Yep. So we're not going to read the whole thing, right?
No.
You guys can read it. If you haven't read it, then you need to read it. But there is an interaction there in which Bernie Sanders really kind of calls out where we are.
Yeah,
we are
and
definitely in a
going.
post-Christian world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking. The interesting thing is, as you and I would read this transcript of him questioning this guy, we can sit there and say, why didn't he say this or why didn't he say that? Yeah. But it appears, so caught off guard at where the world is that he wasn't ready, and we've all been there. So one of the applications now is, okay, we know this is where the world is going, because this was in 2016, 5 years ago, right?
Yeah.
5 years ago that this happened.
And it's no surprise.
No.
Where we're at now.
Right. The world has changed completely in 5 years, and it's worse. So now we know, okay, let's make sure, number one, that we are preparing our kids to be able to interact in this way, because we should be ready that this is the world we live in.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and interesting start to the chapter, but wow, what an eye-opener. The world sees Christians and Christianity as haters.
Right.
And to where anything that's contrary to their liberal post-Christian agenda, it's like, whoa, wait a second, you hate me because
right.
I don't
because we disagree, right?
Just because.
So let's lay this down biblically first, right? Theologically, biblically. Jesus said, "If you love me, the world's going to hate you."
Exactly.
So we know that, right? We're not going against that. And I've been preaching through Acts, and we're into Acts. We're into Acts 18 now. Okay. And one of the things I've been bringing out for our people is how often Paul gets, the Jews hate him, of course, and they're going after him, and they drag him before the government. And the one repeating accusation towards Paul is that the things that he's teaching go contrary to the laws and cause people to be unpeaceful. So we know that's not what Paul was teaching. So here's the flip side of that, though. Is that not happening now? Isn't that the way Christians are viewed, that if you disagree, you are actually being unlawful? As Bernie Sanders says right here, you are un-American if you think that way.
Wow. Yeah.
So number one, I guess I would say, whatever, my citizenship is in heaven. But the point is that's the way people think of us, and is there a way then that we can help that? We know that there are always going to be people that hate us, but is there a way we can change that narrative to an extent?
Well, and then be able to speak into that,
right? That
narrative,
right?
And that's where this resilient conversation is so important, because we're talking about the future leaders of the church in a 2050 culture, where we're seeing 2050 in a lot of ways today. Again, that was 2016 that Bernie had that interview.
Right.
And it's like, okay, how are we preparing our kids?
Right.
How do we invest, as Pastor Jonathan meant? We got to invest into the lives of these kids so that they can, And the book talks a little bit more about that spine and heart in this chapter.
Right.
And how do we build that? How do we instill in them that spine, that tenacity, that grit, and then the spiritual wisdom to be able to speak into that culture with truth, but then also love.
Well, I think you said it, the wisdom. Okay, how do I do this with truth, but still convey that I love them, that we care
both
about
are
them,
important, right?
We might, their sin is not okay, but we need to love them. Exactly. Yeah. And I think for me, what I was noticing, or what was really sticking out to me in my, as I was reviewing this, so this chapter, I actually got a little extra, Scott. Yeah, I remembered enough. I sat and I actually read it through, and then went back and reviewed it again. And the thing that stuck out to me was a lot of the things they talk about are the things we're struggling with as a church now. So what we're seeing is us as Christian adults, we're not even in that. If we're going to lead our kids this way, we're not there yet. We're struggling with those things. So maybe it starts with us first. We say, okay, how do we apply this? Well, we know that we need to prepare our kids, but we first need to change our hearts and be ready.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
So as we work through here, guys, if you don't know how we do this, usually we just kind of take the book and start flipping through the pages, right? We have stuff highlighted. So as there's things, if there's something that has stuck out to you, you jump in here as we talk about this. But I love this idea that has been pointed out that Christians over the years have been generous givers, and they say, hey, look at the world around you and understand where we would be if it wasn't for Christians and all of the things that we have given. So there again, there's a challenge. What are we doing personally, and what are we doing as a church to be salt and light? Right. I recently challenged our church with that in an evangelism series I'm doing, and salt doesn't just season. Salt had worth. That's what Roman soldiers were paid in. Are we bringing worth and value to the world around us as they bring out here that Christians have done?
Yeah.
And I think that goes a long ways to show people that we are not haters, because we're caring enough to invest in their community.
Yeah, and showing the love by our actions, not just by our speech. But I think we can also work at how we engage with the world in the social media realms. And there are times where I'm like, ooh, boy, that might not have been the most tactful way of going about it. So, and I think the book even mentions that I think we've kind of maybe been at fault, the ones, giving our own label.
Yeah, well, we're quick to throw a little hate at
jab.
Somebody we disagree with, rather than, as Scripture says, pray for them.
Pray for them, yep.
And love them, yeah. And we try to, I think social media, and you're now getting on a kind of a pet peeve of mine, but social media has allowed us to, has really helped us, I guess would be a better term, not live in a way that we should, because it's so easy to see something, we laugh at it, we think, that's great, and we just click that little share button, and now what are we doing? We're throwing a little jab at somebody, and there's not love there. All right. It doesn't mean we have to agree with what they're doing. It just means that we have to be careful, because ultimately what happens on this earth, it does not last. Right. So I want to make sure that I'm not doing something that's going to create an eternal impact.
Right.
By something here.
In a negative way.
Right. In a negative way. Yeah. Exactly. Because we look around and we see the world we live in. I mean, we see this conversation, and it's easy to throw hate instead of care and love. And
I try to practice that within the social media realm, where if I'm speaking into something that's, controversial, or there's different views, I might start writing something, and I take a step back, and you got to kind of be wise in how we interact in the social media world, because it's so easy to not only, person to person, it's easier to have a conversation because you're reading body language and everything, but it's so easy to be misinterpreted in the social media world. And then also for us too, I think in our mindset, we are like, well, duh, from this perspective of conservatism or traditional, world, traditional views, but no more is that the case. And so oftentimes we have to re-educate not only ourselves, but then the people we're talking to say, well, this is why.
Right.
And answer that question instead of it being assumed that, no, this is what I believe.
And it's so divisive today. Any disagreement, especially, you know, and I say political because they talk about it here in this chapter, but political views. I mean, some of you may be listening, watching, where you were just whether or not you wore a mask in church became this huge deal that, you know, there's churches that split because of a mask. Like, that's the craziest thing, right? So that's where we are, so we have to be careful. You talked about social media. I'm super careful on social media, but I'm also careful in person-to-person conversations. If it's something that I can just kind of stay out of, I will, because, you know, in those divisive conversations. I'm not saying we can't stand up for what's right, but there's so many conversations that we have that are about our own comfort and our own care.
Oh, right.
I've just learned so much studying through Acts and seeing how Paul never really defended his freedom. I think it's interesting. We were just studying when he was arrested in Philippi, and what really stuck out to me, and I encouraged our people with, was Paul. Once Paul was arrested, when he was being, you know, really unfairly tried, not really even tried, he had an opportunity then, and us as Americans would have said, "Hey, I'm an American. I have my freedoms." And but he was a Roman, right? He didn't say, "I'm a Roman. I have my freedoms." He understood that this God's plan is far above our freedoms, so he allowed this to carry through. He was put in prison. He was able to lead the jailer to Christ, right? And God used him there. And then they say, "Okay, we're going to let you go." And he says, "Oh, no, you're not. No, you're not. I'm not just quietly leaving." But it wasn't for his good that he stood up for those freedoms. He stood up because he was already free to go.
Right.
He stood up for those who would come behind him, and he stood up for those freedoms. So when we think about it, that was really a challenge to me. And I really feel like what we're talking about here. Are we going to stand for America? The book even says we become Americans before we become Christians, right? So are we going to stand for our freedoms? I mean, you guys tell me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I hear all the time about our God-given freedoms. God has given us the right to be free, and I don't see that anywhere in Scripture.
Right. Oh, yeah.
We have a privilege.
Quite the opposite,
right,
as far as believers are
Absolutely.
concerned.
We just celebrated Memorial Day, right? I am beyond grateful for those men who have given me not a right, but a privilege to be free, right? And maybe it is a constitutionally given right, but it is not a God-given right that I am free.
Well, now it's being pushed to, it's my right to have a cell phone, or it's my, like, it's just a different world we live in. Yeah.
So, we don't even have a right to call ourselves Christians except for Christ. That's where we are.
Yep.
So, I think that really challenged me. Guys, let me know let us know what you're thinking. I'm used to talking to the camera myself.
Okay.
So not trying to push you out there, Scott. But, let us know what you're thinking there. I think you were talking about social media. How do we present ourselves? I truly believe that my channel is not growing as fast as it could. I'm not trying to say I'm this martyr or what, by any means, but I've made intentional choices even on YouTube to not just follow these negative stories in Christianity.
Or the social,
Right. I mean, there may be a day that I do when I feel there's a reason, not that I'm going to chase them all, but I would rather I believe if we know how to think right?
Yeah,
think different, think biblically.
Think biblically, have a biblical worldview.
Then we know how to handle those, right? I don't want to babysit people through those all the time. But that's what everybody wants. That's what people get on YouTube and watch is all this. Tell me about the latest gossip, even if it's in Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah, and today is June 1st, and my phone and everywhere that I look on my phone reminds me of the fact that today is the start of the LGBTQ plus Pride Month.
Mm-hmm.
Our culture is screaming this stuff. And how do we and I'm asking myself this, but maybe you could speak into this or anyone else out there, how do we speak into this culture today? And how do we then learn from that to then help our kids understand how they can have a voice in a culture that is so enamored with this, you're a hater if you say anything against another person's view.
Right.
And only if it's that against the progressive view.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I mean,
they say they want you to be open-minded only until you disagree with them. They're not open-minded. Right. So that's the world we live in. How
that
do we
whole
do that?
tolerance thing is
so
funny.
You guys have heard me say this before, and I'll say it again here. I think for what we're trying to teach our people especially, I think that's a great question, Scott. How do we speak into that? And that feels really overwhelming, doesn't it?
Oh my goodness, to the point where you don't do anything.
Right.
Then that's where I'm kind of at. When I see posts or I see things that I feel like I should speak up. Not against, but have a voice in.
So I guess when it comes to that stuff, I just don't. Right. I just don't feel like Facebook is the place to start putting that. You know, people post stuff on mine, on my Facebook page, and I'm like, you know, but I just leave it. Right. If I can have a person-to-person talk with them. But what do we need to do? We need to be teaching our kids as parents, as Awana leaders, or I should say youth leaders, right? We say this is Awana, but it's not just for Awana. So as youth leaders, be brave enough to have those conversations, stir those conversations. We've talked about that several times. And I think the biggest key is, so we're speaking into the lives of those around us, right, that we're trying to teach and train up, whether it's our own kids or our church kids that we're responsible for in some way, right? But again, I just, one of the things I think the Lord has really encouraged me with, and I've been able to start encouraging our people, it's so easy for us to see the big picture and get overwhelmed and do nothing, rather than let's do what's in front of us.
Right.
So pray and prepare your heart, and then as God puts one of those kind of people in front of you, right, one of those people in front of you, now we're prepared, and we can impact their life, because we're probably not going to impact this to the big. I mean, even in our local community, we're probably not.
Right.
And it's difficult because if you do that, it's really hard to do that without showing and still be able to show love, right? You're more of a hater, and it's just the way that society sees it, right? So, but if I can come alongside of a person and know that's the way they are, they know what I believe, but I don't treat them differently because of that. Now they start to see, that's one more person that starts to see that these people are not the haters I've been told that they are. And then that gives you an opportunity, because ultimately, we need to push back against the darkness, but just pushing back against the darkness, I mean, if we could pass laws to get all that like outlawed or whatever, what did that really change? Because we did not change man's heart.
Right. Yeah, it's the heart of man.
Now it's just done in hiding instead of in the open. So ultimately, if we want to change this, we've got to start one by one changing hearts through the gospel.
Certainly. Yep. Love it. And we're generous. I mean, like you bring it back to what you kind of started with. Yes. It's like
you got to be givers.
We got to be givers, and there's other ways that we can show love to a culture, and I think that needs to come first in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And they've got to see that our heart is right, and we're not attacking, but we want to love and speak truth in that.
So another thing we've been learning, you guys are going to hear me talk about Acts a lot. I just feel like Acts has been amazing for us where we are as a church, as we look at disciple-making, evangelism. And we're learning so much from Paul. One of the things Paul did was he was very strategic, right? He didn't just sit around and hope for things to happen. He was very strategic, and Jesus was very strategic as well. And so as churches, we need to be strategic. As individuals, we need to be strategic. But sometimes strategic is being generous and giving into the community to build those relationships, to show people we don't hate, we're not closed door, we want to give back. But knowing ultimately now we're trying to get an opportunity with them. We have a saying we say around here, you got to spend money to buy time, right? So if I want to have an opportunity with somebody, sometimes it's as simple as I'm going to buy you a dinner,
right? Yeah.
So we can sit down. But being generous as Christians and as a church is huge, and it's going to go a long ways. And I think we've seen that even if we want to pull this back. I know a lot of this conversation doesn't feel very Awana, right? But we're thinking big picture. We've got to change the church before we can have a place where we can start teaching the kids. But on the same hand, what has gone the farthest for a lot of our kids is when even as leaders, we're generous to them. Right? We give to them. And for a little kid, generous is a $5 meal. I just saw I can go to Wendy's now and get a bag of food for $5, right? There's places you can. And for a lot of our kids who don't have a regular meal, that's just showing them, no, we don't hate you. You might have a different opinion than we do. You might live differently than we believe Scripture says, but I can still love you.
And it doesn't have to be just financial. I mean, the investment of time today, investment of time today is huge.
Well, Jonathan said it so many times. It is financial. We throw money at it, because we don't want to give time.
Right.
Rather than time being the thing that we really need to give.
Exactly. That's where the investment really
right?
lies.
Because what have we so it's a relationship. That's what we're learning in the book, right? It's a relationship.
Yep.
All right. Well, what else we got here, Scott?
I don't know if you brought this out already, but on page 45, that comment, what would our social media feeds indicate about us this year? If you look back at your social media feeds and see, did our political passions outrun our Christian passions? And there are people out there, even in my circles, that they're wanting to talk about the hot topics, and they wanna our government is doing this, and conspiracy theories, all these different things, and a lot of talk about that, but very little from a biblical perspective.
Well, and I find Satan's loving that. Those are distractions from
Huge
making disciples.
Distractions.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Jonathan has a good point here. He says, given the picture of the dominant secular culture, which we've been talking about, aren't you glad that God is building his church and it doesn't fall on our shoulders? Man, that's what we've got to remember. That when we look at this and say, this is intimidating, this is hard, we are doing the God is the one doing the work. We just have to be faithful.
And it's interesting, the voice that is really coming from a minority group of people, right? I mean, the things that we are struggling with or that are in front of our face are from such a minority, and we've got to understand that we're not alone in this.
Right.
We're not alone. There's a majority that's really silent today.
Yeah.
And God will build his church despite us, right?
Oh yeah, I remind our people constantly, Jesus promised he will build his church. Does the culture matter? No.
Right.
Does the place matter? No. None of that matters. So no matter how hard it gets, 2050 is going to be a lot worse than it is today. Is God still going to build his church? Yes.
Right.
So we need to be preparing for that. We need to be preparing. He does it, but he's called us to be the tool, right? To be the vessel. So as we're preparing our kids, and that's is that not just when God, the glory of God blows your mind, right?
Yeah.
Because God is still going to build his church, whether we do our part or not. However, there's a human responsibility for us to prepare for that and prepare our kids for that as well. I'm always reminded, if I'm not going to do it, God's going to go find somebody else that will. So I might as well just obey and get the blessing.
Right. Yeah.
So let's be intentional, right? Let's do the things we're learning and resilient and be intentional.
Do what we're
so we can get the blessing, right?
And the book brings us out too that that Huffington Post article that was really bashing the church quite a bit, and it the reality is that those churches that are falling out are the ones that are trying to become more progressive.
Yes.
The stronger churches are the churches that are sticking to the biblical truth, going against that mainline narrative that says, you got to accept everybody, all those things that are,
right.
Predominantly progressive and, and that's coming into the church. Those churches are the ones that are falling out.
Right.
And God is building his church through people who are committed to biblical truth.
Yeah.
And preaching the gospel.
Well, and I think we've seen that. Pretty much any pastor that we've talked to that you could talk to nowadays. Yeah, I say nowadays. I sound like I'm right, but I mean, even just since a year ago, we would say that we have seen God weeding out the tares in his churches. Right, churches that are now not going to open because of COVID or whatever. There's just all these things that have happened. God has clearly been weeding out his church, and so to your point, we're seeing that. We can sit around and be so frustrated and discouraged with these churches. God knows who they are. God's got this.
And there's going to be a remnant. And, the book started with Hayden at the flagpole all alone.
Right.
And that's where our kids are going to be at some level.
Right.
And preparing, we got to prepare them now to be the one that will stand alone with anyone supporting them and standing up for the truth of what God's called them to and living out in the hostile culture that they're gonna have in front of them.
Well, and two, we just got to make sure we're focused on the good things that are happening. I mean, when you hear a story here, a church, right here in Michigan, that's full force. Like we're gonna we're going with this Awana thing. We're going to reach kids. That is God's work in hearts. That is God stirring people. In the darkness, there is still light, and we just need to stay at it. And it helps us to find those good news, good news. And
COVID has exposed quite a bit. And I think out of this, we could see a revival of the church coming back to what is the most important.
Yeah, right? I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with other pastors that have said, man, we now look back and say, maybe this wasn't the best thing we were doing. Through our disciple-making culture that we've been building here over several years, we have gotten quite intentional with with what we would call our programs, right? Because programs are not going to get us anywhere. We need to make sure that those are helping us towards our mission. And so we have really felt like we have pared back on a lot of that stuff. And then even to this day, we coming back, a year and a half later, whatever it is, it's been a long time. So it's been a year in June that we're back. So we're still having that conversation saying, man, there are so many things that maybe we don't need to be doing that would give us opportunity to do other things.
Love to hear from people out there, the shift that they've seen within their own church, some things that they've adjusted and because of COVID and has it brought a life back to the ministry? Is there some excitement that has come out of this for what God would have us do and discipleship?
Yeah, we've had several of those conversations in our church. So drop that in the chat. I think we're getting about ready to wrap up here, but I don't want to lose the last point there, Scott, that you and I talked about, the test, right? The example was given of miners who would go into the mine and they would take a canary because if there was a depletion of the oxygen, the canary would die first, right? So they would watch that canary, and if that canary dropped over dead, they knew there was something wrong, and they got out of there. And so the book says, and it's so true, that the children are really the canary of the church. So as there are no more children, the church is dying, and it's just completely. I mean, it's so true. So I want to challenge people today to really think about your ministries, your church. How many kids do you have, right? If you don't have many, why? Right? Why do you not have many? And I'm not talking about just Awana. We're talking about the whole of the church. And because ultimately, is that not the goal of our youth ministries? It's to reach the kids we have and bring families, right? It's not just about having a whole bunch of kids.
Right.
So what are we looking at here? Are we in a position where we're losing kids, and now, the church, at that point, the church is dying.
Yeah, what is the plan for the future of that church?
How are you going to change that?
Yeah. And the book talks about, this, I'm going to read this sentence because I think it's where we're at right now. The church needs to commit itself to resilient child discipleship if we are to hope to face the future with a resilient remnant of resistant and loving disciples.
Yeah. So don't lose the ones you have.
Don't lose the ones you have.
And then start figuring out how you're going to get more.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And we've said so many times, one of the things I think the Lord has just really opened my eyes to when it comes to disciple making is that is his plan for building the church. We can have as many programs as we want. We can bring hundreds and hundreds of people in on, for some big activity, but ultimately those things don't. How much fruit do we really see from those, right? Sometimes we see people say, but then what do we do with those babies? There's so many things. But if we're out there duplicating ourselves, as the Great Commission calls us to, what are we doing? We're preserving the life of our church, right? If I make a disciple who comes behind me, when I'm gone, who is there?
Right.
That person
that
is.
Person.
And if they then learn to make a disciple, right? So now we have perpetual growth in the church.
And the hope is that they're not infants and they don't stay infants. Right.
Well, that's a whole nother topic. There's a way around that. I think the Bible talks about that too. Oh, you guys could get us going forever. Well, hey, thanks. We really should wrap this thing up. Make sure you share this, though, everybody. So thanks again. We'll give you a date soon for next month, and we're read chapter 4. Be ready.
That's right.
And thanks so much. See you guys later.
Bye.